Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we are calling our conversations with Walt Whitman in the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to one of the most difficult poems in Leaves of Grass. Difficult for reasons that we'll obviously have to get into. But it's going to surprise us why it's difficult. Sitting where it sits in drum taps, when I say, if you've just picked up Leaves of Grass and you've been reading with me all the way up, and all of a sudden we hit this poem, Ethiopia saluting the colors, we're going to find ourselves asking, what is it that's so painfully difficult, and I'll even say it, awkward about this poem? It's going to have to do with Whitman's views regarding what was sometimes called the slavery question or the black question back in the day, namely, of course, the issue of racism. And when we pick up this poem, as we have said several times, we're not going to run from the fact that Whitman engaged in a certain kind of cultural racism of his day. We're not going to try and paint that as if that didn't happen. We want to obviously be fair in our treatment of this poem and Whitman, but we're going to obviously say what it actually is. This is a hard poem. This is an awkward poem for us to study, and yet study it we shall. This is poem 28 of the 43 of Drum Taps. I want to remind us again that Whitman said in To Thee, O Cause, that my book and the war are one, and I think one of the things about that scholars have constantly struggled with is these understandings of the motivations for the war itself, especially the motivations as it relates to Whitman. For example, are we fighting this war and all of these people are dying to save the Union and preserve the Union because the southern states have seceded, or we are in fact fighting for the emancipation of slaves? That, of course, was a hotly debated topic in Whitman's own time, and I think Whitman himself struggled with it, as I think we're going to see it even in a poem like this. Now, our assumptions, I think you've been working with us at LearnStrong.net down the left-hand side. We've given lectures on every single poem, beginning with those opening poems and inscriptions up through an introductory set of comments for drum taps, and then we have finished recently with Artilleryman's Vision. Now, Norton's is going to give us a good amount of background here, because again, this poem is very controversial in Leaves of Grass. Whitman composed this poem, Norton's tells us, in 1867 with the title Ethiopia Commenting, and submitted it in September 7th to the Galaxy magazine for $25. Although he thought it was accepted, it was never printed, and he withdrew it on November the 2nd, 1868. It first appeared in Leaves of Grass in 1871 and again in 1876 under its present title, accompanied by the subtitle A Reminiscence of 1864, and within the group, later dropped, entitled Bathed in War's Perfume. It was transferred to Drum Taps in 1881. Note that the poem not only employs regular stanzic structure, but also both internal and terminal rhyme, and we'll see this at the very end of some of the lines, as we pointed out. Now, we in this poem will see and feel, I think more feel than anything, Whitman's anxiety about the slavery question. That is to say, often it was referred to as the black question. And as we look at this poem, we're going to identify right away the use of the word Ethiopia as a word that will signify the other. Now, you'll remember that Ethiopia does get used in Song of the Broad Axe 7, right? Venerable men of Ethiopia was the reference there. And as well in old chants, we're going to hear this word Ethiopia as representative of an obscure place in Africa where many slaves are thought to have come from, right, in Whitman's day. We begin with a question, who are you, which will take us back to a site in camp where he asked the same question. And then the use of the word dusky. Who are you, dusky woman, so ancient, hardly human, with your woolly white and turbaned head and bare bony feet? Why rising by the roadside here? Do you the colors greet? 'Tis while our army lines Carolina sands and pines, forth from thy hovel door, thou Ethiopian comest to me, as under doughty Sherman I march toward the sea. Me, master, years 100 since from my parents sundered, a little child, they caught me as the savage beast is caught, then hither me across the sea the cruel slaver brought. No further does she say, but lingering all the day, her high-born turban head she wags and rolls her darkling eye, and curtsies to the regiments, the guidance moving by. What is it, fateful woman, so blear, hardly human? Why wag your head with turban bound? yellow, red, and green. Are the things so strange and marvelous you see or have seen? Now, there will be any number of readers who will look at this poem right away and be repulsed by it, and rightfully so. But let's go ahead and study what it is Whitman, I think, is trying to do. I think there's a reason why this poem is placed where it is placed in drum taps. I think there's some intentionality here on the part of Whitman to return again to the question of why must so many have died in a civil war? What is the real reason? And he will focus here. One of the only times that he will focus on the slavery question in all of Leaves of Grass. So we want to pay attention to it. Again, notice, who are you? Dusky woman. Obviously, this dusky woman will reference skin color, right? Although dusky can also have to do with ignorance. No, let's be fair. From Dakota's canons, we'll hear this one other time referenced to the Sioux, as in Dusky Sioux. So ancient, meaning very old. Hardly human is going to be used one more time along with savage beast. And this idea of the other, I think, is what now is being emphasized by Whitman. The misunderstood possibly is the more generous reading, but for sure it is possibly that Whitman is pointing out how little she's understood, the other. With your woolly, white, and turbaned head. Of course, everything about this is exotic, pointing out how exotic she is. And bare, bony feet. Notice that's a rhetorical question. Who are you? With a question mark. And I think that's a legitimate kind of question, because no one knows who she is, right? She has no identity. And notice the question, why rising by the roadside here, do you the colors greet? In other words, this is an image where as the soldiers come through, by the way, this is Sherman's leading to the sea, right? In the famous journey that he's taking. And the question is, why are you standing up to applaud what's happening? Well, you know, obviously it's a strange rhetorical question on a number of counts. And then notice in parenthetics, we get the background. 'Tis while our army lines Carolina's sands and pines, forth from thy hovel, in other words, she's very poor, door, thou Ethiopia comest to me, as under doughty Sherman I march toward the sea. By the way, notice the end rhyme here. And of course, Sherman's track from 15 November to 21 December of 1864, when Sherman, of course, took the South and just destroyed in his way. Now, the most awkward part of this poem is this italicized attempt to try to capture the linguistic nuances of this woman, this ancient woman. She will say it this way, me, master, years 100 since from my parents sundered. Now, she's 100 years old, which makes her so ancient, right? And that maybe is what hardly human is saying. She's so old she doesn't look alive. In other words, she was taken. A little child, they caught me as the savage beast is caught. Again, now this idea of savage and the idea of beast will take us back to hardly human. Then hither me across the sea, the cruel slaver brought. By the way, the word slaver gets used only one time in Leaves of Grass, and it's here. Slavery only gets used 3 times. We're going to see it again in Lilac's Last with section 6. It's awkward it's to try and capture the nuances linguistically, it's awkward. It's awkward all the way around, and yet now we come back. No further does she say, but lingering all the day, again, the rhyme and the rhythm. Her high-born turban, it's interesting, high-born. Right, and it can mean that she's wearing it high, or it can also mean that she looks regal. Turbaned head she wags. Again, this idea of the language that's animalistic in some ways, bestial some have even called it, and rolls her darkling eye. And of course, this is more language that dehumanizes this woman. And curtsies to the regiments, the guidons moving by, and of course she pays attention to the flags and the like. And now we finish where we start in this somewhat strange and awkward poem with a series of rhetorical questions. What is it, fateful woman? It's interesting that he calls her fateful, right? So blear, that is to say, you know, kind of dull, hardly human. In other words, maybe he's commenting on the fact that she's old. Maybe he's commenting on the fact that she is black. It's hard to decipher exactly what Whitman is at here. Why wag, we're back to wag, why wag your head with turban bound? And then of course the colors that would be associated with Africa and Ethiopia, yellow, red, and green. Are the things so strange, we're back to that word curious that's so popular in drum taps, and marvelous you see or have seen? Now, the rhetorical final line of this is even more bizarre. In other words, why wouldn't she be stunned that Sherman and his troops are bringing what hopefully will be emancipation for her? In other words, this poem seems to suggest maybe she doesn't understand at all what really is going on. Of course, Whitman may be suggesting that most Americans don't really understand what really is going on. The chaos, again, of the war being emphasized in all of Drum Taps. Well, at 2A, what are we going to say about possible messages here? Well, I think one argument, and it's probably a generous reading of this poem, is that Whitman's making the argument that the only way that Lincoln was going to be able to actually emancipate the slaves was for a war to be fought and for a lot of people to die, a lot of people that have been emphasized in Drum Taps for sure. Most of the North, I think, is another message here. Most of the North couldn't understand or relate to the black slave experience and their experience of life, and saw them as the foreign. And that, I think, is also a pivotal way to read this poem as well. At 2B, I think that the closed form with the 5 stanzas and the 3 lines and the end rhyme and the sing-songy effect of this, I think in some way simplifies what for Whitman was probably not a very simple kind of formulation or equation. And you know, we can go back and you can look, and scholars have done this, Jerome Loving has done this, a number of scholars have done this, where you go back and you read what Whitman actually wrote about slavery, and it's not completely clear the level to which he was an abolitionist all his life, and when he began to kind of move increasingly towards the abolitionist position. At 3A, well, we have to mention here Conrad's Heart of Darkness, because I think the same confusion exists there as well for a writer like Conrad. And I want to mention Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind of 1936. I think that Mitchell also was confused about how to actually address this. And we today, of course, read lines like this and Gone with the Wind, and we're like, I don't understand how people could have such confusion. And yet it is a cultural confusion of the time, and we have to embrace it and accept that it existed. We're not going to run from it. At 3B, finally, are you uncomfortable by the reading of this poem and the study of this poem? And if so, why? And how do you deal with America's racist past? And we do have a racist past. There's no question about that. And a poem like this proves it in the middle of a precious collection of poems, Leaves of Grass. Here is a poem that is going to make some readers stop reading Leaves of Grass, which is sad in itself, but there are readers who will say, I'm done with them. I can't go anywhere beyond a poem like this. I cannot believe a poem like this exists. And yet I think that's why we read Leaves of Grass. In all ways, as he says it, the book, his book and the war are one. Trying to come to terms with what is happening as I think foundational to great art. And of course, we're going to argue that Whitman is a great poet and he is producing great art, even though at times we're uncomfortable, and this is awkward stuff, there's no question. Finally, I can ask this, are we as a nation finally moving beyond the racism of our past, or is the black experience still foreign to most white Americans? And I think reading Leaves of Grass, and especially a poem like this, helps us to have that conversation. I hope that reading Leaves of Grass is challenging us in lots of ways. Thank you.